For a look at what's ahead on the foreign policy front, we're joined by the former U.S. ambassador to Russia, John Sullivan, CBS News national security contributor Michael Morell, former Obama administration undersecretary of defense for policy Michele Fluornoy, and former Trump administration national security advisor General H.R. McMaster, who joins us from Palo Alto. It's good to have all of you here. February 24th, 2022 was a wake-up call for the world on the national security front. And Ambassador Sullivan, I know you were posted to Moscow at the time. European nations really didn't believe the United States this was going to happen, and then it did. What was that like?
We knew it was going to happen. We'd been predicting it for months. I'd spoken to Secretary Blinken just a few days before on February 19th, and he asked me what the mood was, and I said it felt like August 31st, 1939, a world leader was going to launch an aggressive war on the European continent with unknown consequences. I then thought, geez, I hope I haven't overstated this, but we were very confident in our assessment about what he was going to do. The only question was when.
But what was so surreal as a reporter was that all of our allies were doubting that Vladimir Putin would do this.
Yeah. I spent a lot of time talking to fellow ambassadors in Moscow, the U.S. business community in Moscow. They said, "Oh, you're Chicken Little. The sky is falling." Absolutely not. This is irrational. Putin would never do it. Those same people on February 25th were texting me on their way to the airport saying goodbye. I was right.
To date, sanctions have not stopped Vladimir Putin, and he is making clear that this war is going to continue, and that has global ramifications.
Absolutely. I think in 2023, we're likely to see minimal Russian gains on the military battlefield, but more of Putin's spoiler campaign, where he's using missiles and drones to take out civilian infrastructure, target electricity, target water supplies, really trying to break the will of the Ukrainian people, while also hoping that Europe has a very cold, dark winter and the energy prices, the risk of a recession. He's seeking to break the will of the Ukrainians and of NATO. I don't think he's going to be successful. I think in 2023, we're either going to see some kind of escalation on Putin's side and/or possibly both, some entry into some negotiations. If in fact the Western and Ukrainian will holds and Putin realizes he can't actually achieve his objectives, so he wants to put lipstick on a pig and declare victory somehow.
General McMaster, Vladimir Putin just recently visited a military outpost for the first time with his generals. Some have read that as an indication that he is doubling down. What do you see happening here? Some Ukrainian generals are forecasting a Russian offensive could begin as soon as January.
I think that's likely to be the case, Margaret, but it's going to fail. I mean, Putin is in denial. He's a man who's always been obsessed, right? Obsessed with restoring Russia to national greatness. And he fancied himself as the new czar presiding over an expanding Russian empire. Well, he's failed utterly, but he's increasingly isolated. You know, Putin, he's kind of a street thug. I mean, he's a bully and a coward at the same time. I think now we have agency, Margaret. We can stop meting out assistance. We can give the Ukrainians what they need to protect their population and their infrastructure, and to sustain a counteroffensive to regain at least the territories taken since the renewed offensive on February 24th.
Mike Morell, I want to know what you think the red line is. From what I hear, it's Crimea. That if the Ukrainians tried to retake that area, that might lead to the escalation that you were just referring to. What are your thoughts on that and the contact that the CIA is having with Russian intelligence?
So Crimea is the most important piece for Putin, right, in terms of what he's taken since 2014. But I'm not sure what that escalation could look like. I mean, he doesn't have a lot left from a military perspective. His troops, as a matter of fact, are digging in to defensive positions in eastern Ukraine right now. I'm not sure what he can do, what he has left in his bag if the Ukrainians were to go into Crimea, and I would not dissuade them from doing that.
Director Burns did have contact. He met face-to-face with his Russian counterpart. I mean, the intelligence channels are open. They're open, but when you hear escalation, people fear Vladimir Putin's nuclear arsenal. What is the probability of it being used?
So I hope that part of the communication, right, between Director Burns and his counterparts in Russia are, here is what the United States will do if you were to use a nuclear weapon or biological weapons on the battlefield. And I hope that we've sent a message that our response would be significant and consequential.
What does significant look like?
I think what it looks like is U.S. forces attacking Russian forces inside Ukraine. I think that would force Vladimir Putin to think twice.
I think the international dimension is important here. I mean, Putin is pretty isolated, but you've had the Prime Minister of India come out and say, we don't want to see nuclear weapons used. You've had Xi Jinping, probably Putin's closest ally, come out and be very clear that nuclear weapons should not be used. So I think Putin would also find him incredibly isolated, not only from the West, but from much of the international community as well.
Ambassador Sullivan, does Putin care that he's isolated?
We made the same arguments to him to not invade Ukraine, that it'd be isolated, that the consequences would be devastating. That turned out to be true. 141 countries condemned and deplored the invasion of Ukraine by Russia in the General Assembly just after it occurred. He doesn't care. He's got his plan. He's going to regather the Russian lands. His response would be, Peter the Great didn't care what other leaders thought. Peter the Great did what he needed to do to gather the Russian lands, this mythic, in some sense, in his own mind, Russian empire that he wants to restore. He's messianic. He doesn't care.
Well, that's terrifying. I want to take a very quick break because we have so many more national security issues to continue to talk about. We'll be back with more of our panel. Stay with us. And we continue our conversation now with our foreign policy panel. H.R. McMaster, General McMaster, I want to ask you from a military perspective, we heard the CIA director describe a full-fledged military partnership between Russia and Iran. What does this look like?
Well, I think where it heads next is support for Russia's war-making machine more broadly. I think you're going to see missiles. You already have reports of Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps trainers and assemblers of these drones. And I think what we're recognizing is these problem sets that we're facing with the theocratic dictatorship in Iran and the revanchist hyper-nationalist Putin, they're connected to each other. And they're connected to China. So I think we are hopefully now in full recognition that we are in really consequential competitions with authoritarian regimes who are hostile to us. And we have to respond much more effectively than we responded in the past. And that's a broad range of, I think, preparations for potential military conflict so we can deter a widening of the war. But there's also very significant economic and diplomatic aspects of these interconnected problems.
One of the things you're saying there is recognize that the attempt to broker a nuclear deal with Iran is dead.
It's a pipe dream. It's trying to revive something that is completely dead. And I couldn't believe it, Margaret, as we were supplicating to the Iranian regime as they're intensifying their proxy war in the region and attacking some of our long-standing partners there. And I think we lost a lot of ground in the Middle East because we're chasing this pipe dream of trying to revive this nuclear agreement. And if we did it, what would happen is we'd give Iran a pass on the destructive effect the dictatorship has had on the Iranian economy. If we're going to be in the business of making predictions, I think the chances are quite high of a significant conflict in the Middle East, maybe entailing an Israeli strike on Iran's nuclear program.
Michele Fluornoy, do you agree with that assessment?
The real risk is that in 2023, they will acquire enough material and highly enriched nuclear material to build a bomb. Israel has long articulated that as a red line, that is an unacceptable condition for them to have, to coexist with. And then the decision that places on the U.S. president's desk, do we support them? Do we stand back? What happens? And do we find ourselves in an escalating situation with Iran in the Middle East?
And, Mike, the intelligence community has not determined that Iran actually will make a nuclear weapon. It's just that they're giving themselves the possibility to do so at a future date.
The judgment has always been that what the Iranians want is to get to the threshold, right, to have all the pieces and be able to put them together quickly. Right now, they have enough fissile material enriched to 60% for 4 bombs, and they could get to 90%, which is what is required for a weapon, in a matter of weeks. So in terms of fissile material peace, they're very, very close.
Does the regime, which has withstood many popular protests, withstand what's happening in the streets, which is unique with these protests that were started by young women?
I think you have to look at the current protest in the context of a series of protests that have occurred since 2017. They've all had different causes, but the one thing they have in common is a growing alienation of the young people from the regime, and a growing group of people who want a more normal life and a less rigid life. But at the same time, there's a large number of Iranians who support the regime. 18 million people voted for the current president, who's a hardliner. So I don't think that we're going to see regime change unless there's an incident that takes us in a different direction.
It is so fascinating that the dynamic is there, that it's women who started this round of protests. And it makes me think, Michele, of time and again, as expected, it is the young women who are paying the price for what's happening in Afghanistan following the withdrawal of the United States. Do you buy the argument that that choice to withdraw factored in any way to Russia and China's assessment that the U.S. was in decline?
It's one brick in a wall that they've been building for quite some time that has many bricks, which is why it's so important that we need to invest in our alliances, really demonstrate our credibility when we make foreign policy commitments and so forth. I actually would give the administration some credit for that in terms of pulling NATO together after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, building stronger partnerships in Asia to try to deter and counterbalance China.
Are you optimistic that those alliances in the West will actually remain solid? Because there is an argument that if Vladimir Putin hadn't bombed Kyiv and terrified European leaders, that they wouldn't be united. That it's not just diplomacy, it was actual fear.
But we are where we are. And I think the NATO alliance and the US-EU relationship, they have found their purpose again. There's a tremendous amount of transatlantic unity that I think is quite solid. I also think as Beijing overplays their hand, that actually bolsters our alliances and our partnerships in the region. But we have to play our cards well and seriously compete, not only diplomatically, but shoring up deterrence militarily, competing economically, technologically, keeping our edge, making the right investments at home.
Ambassador Sullivan, you're not at the State Department anymore, so you can speak freely. How much of the withdrawal, how it was executed, and the agreement with the Taliban is responsible for shaping the perception of weakness of the West?
I completely agree with Michele that the Russians, Beijing, they will use any misstep by the United States, real or imagined, against us in their false narrative. Unfortunately, in this case, we did make a major misstep, I think, particularly in how we implemented the withdrawal. There's no doubt in my mind that it factored in, at least in some way, in the Russians' calculation about our strength, our ability to convince allies and partners to oppose what the Russians were doing, our credibility. Did it ultimately turn out to be the case? No. As with so many things, Putin was wrong about that, too.
Mike, after the fall of Kabul, you were on this program and you correctly forecast that the Taliban knew where al-Qaeda's leader was inside Afghanistan.
Right.
So I'm wondering what your thought is about where the emerging terror threat is now.
So al-Qaeda is a problem that needs to be watched in Afghanistan. The bigger problem in Afghanistan at the moment is ISIS. They are increasingly recruiting from neighboring countries, and those individuals are coming in where they're getting training from ISIS, and the concern is that they might leave Afghanistan, go back to their home countries, and conduct attacks against Western interests. Think embassies. The bigger terrorism problem is actually in Africa, all the way from Somalia all the way to West Africa, where you've got both al-Qaeda affiliates and you've got ISIS affiliates. They have control huge swaths of territory. They've conducted primarily local attacks so far, but at some point, Western embassies, Western military bases in both Africa and possibly in Europe could become targets. And if we're going to make a prediction for 2023, I'd say we're going to see a terrorist attack against a Western interest somewhere in the world.
Well, that's terrifying. It's sobering. It's a reminder that declaring victory was too early.
Terrorism has always waxed and waned. It has always gone up and down, and I think it's starting to bounce back again.
General McMaster, do you agree with that assessment that the emergent threat is coming out of Africa?
I do, but it's also coming out of Afghanistan, and it's also coming out of the Middle East still. And ISIS in Syria has not been defeated. And the main lesson from 9/11 is that threats, jihadist threats that develop abroad, can only be dealt with at an exorbitant cost once they reach our shores. So sustained engagement through partners, like the partners we abandoned in Afghanistan, is really critical to our own safety and security.
I want to transition to the other looming threat that you hear the administration saying it will turn its eye towards in the new year, and that is China. Michele Fluornoy, where do you begin to try to de-escalate?
Well, I think there is a desire to sort of right the apple cart. That said, neither side is going to change its fundamental interests, and those interests are in many ways in conflict. So there is a competition ongoing, and it's economic, it's technological, it's informational, it's political, it's military. I think the real name of the game in 2023 is shoring up deterrence. I don't think President Xi wants to move on Taiwan. He's got, COVID to deal with. He's got a youth unemployment problem to deal with. He's got all kinds of domestic challenges. And I think he'd prefer to take Taiwan using economic and political coercion ultimately. But he has instructed his military, be ready by 2027. So we've got the next few years to really make sure that he cannot have confidence in his ability to succeed militarily. So that means we have a lot of investment to do alongside investing in the drivers of our economic competitiveness, our technological competitiveness as well.
Ambassador Sullivan, how does Secretary Blinken approach this sort of trying to defrost this frozen relationship?
We're not going to do this alone. We just saw the Japanese government announcing its new national security and defense strategy, significantly increasing its defense budget. Our European allies and partners becoming more forthright about the threat that they see, the challenges they see from China.
And I want to get to General McMaster, because I know you spend a lot of time on thinking about China. How do you see it?
It's a grave threat. I think Xi Jinping means what he says, right? I think we have to be careful not to mirror image, not to fall into the same traps we did with Vladimir Putin of confirmation bias and optimism bias. Xi Jinping has made quite clear in his statements that he's going to make, from his perspective, China whole again by subsuming Taiwan. And the preparations are underway. So I think what is important is what Michele said, deterrence, but good old-fashioned deterrence by denial. I mean, hard power matters. And I think we are underinvested in defense in the United States. China has become increasingly aggressive, not only from an economic and financial perspective and a wolf warrior diplomacy perspective, but physically with its military. And what's really disturbing is I think Xi Jinping is preparing the Chinese people for war. In some of his speeches, he said, well, for us to restore China to national greatness, it's going to take some sacrifices. So I think we have to take it very seriously and act to extend really our power. We talk a lot about relying on our allies, and then maybe if we take a step back, the allies will do more. I think actually the opposite is the case. If Americans just do a little bit more, many of our allies will follow suit and bolster their defense capabilities and capacity as well.
Thanks for joining us.